Canadians feel China has not come clean on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the picture is quite clear, as a new Angus Reid Institute survey points out. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. We're again coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. In the span of just 6 months, the views of Canadians about China have plummeted. The latest numbers from Angus Reid Institute find a mere 14% of us have a favorable opinion of China, and that's down from 29% just before the outbreak. To find out more about Canadians' views right now, I am pleased to be joined by Shachi Kurl, the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. And Shachi, considering the Meng Wanzhou Huawei incident in late 2019, did Canadians hold a favorable opinion on China?
Well, the views of China, and let me be very, very clear, when we talk about these survey data, when we talk about views of China, we're not talking about views of people of Chinese heritage or ethnicity. We're actually talking about views of Beijing, of the Chinese regime. Those views have been deteriorating for a while. They were as high as 58% in 2005, and you've just walked through what they've been more recently. So some of this has had to do with an ongoing perception in the minds of Canadians that China has a problem in terms of its human rights record. Some of it has had to do with the trade wars that we have been dealing with from China. So in the wake of the Meng arrest, and of course, we're talking here about the Huawei executive that the Canadian authorities detained at the request of the U.S. government. Remember, for a while, the Chinese government was then not taking our canola, not taking our grain, refusing to buy from us. Then there has been the detention of the two Michaels, Kovrig and Spaver, who have been held, Canadian citizens in China, who were held initially without any charge for the longest time. They've only recently been told what they're being held for, without the due process and without really the comfort that Ms. Meng is enjoying here in house arrest in Vancouver. So, look, we have had our struggles as Canadians with the Chinese regime for a while. This has been building, and the COVID situation has certainly just driven it that much lower.
What do Canadians want to see done when dealing or trading with China?
So the relationship with China has always been one that is a bit of a tension point, or a push and pull, if you will, between wanting to or being mesmerized at times by the absolutely huge economic market that China represents. And so Canada at times has felt like pursue trade, we should really be doubling down on the economic opportunity. But at the same time, we also really are of a view that human rights needs to be something that has as much or primacy in terms of the relationship. That push and pull, that face-off has, in the last few years, really been very unequivocal in the minds of Canadians. They want to put human rights first. So even if that means economic loss, even if that means opportunities lost in terms of jobs and trade, the Canadians say that this is a country that really needs to be held to account on its human rights record.
Which Canadians are most optimistic and pessimistic about China?
Well, some of that has to do with how you vote politically. But when 85% of Canadians have a negative or an unfavorable view of that country, only 14% have a favorable view. What that means is really it's everyone, right? You've got a massive amount of unanimity. Past conservative voters tend to be a little bit more intense in their unfavorable views of the Chinese regime than Liberal or NDP voters. But let's be very clear. it's across the board. It crosses age demographics. It crosses regional lines. Because again, when you're dealing with a favorability number that is that low, it really just means that everyone is sort of the same mind on this.
Shachi Kurl is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute, as we look at their latest numbers on Canadians' views on the Chinese government. And, a lot of Canadians look to the U.S. Obviously, we've got the clearest view to see how they're dealing with the pandemic. Have Canadians changed their opinions about Americans as well as other countries around the world?
Well, the Canadian views of the United States are now at what we believe is something like a 40-year low. Like it's also at a nadir at the moment. Some of that has to do with what's happening around COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic. But a lot of it, of course, was deteriorating again well before that happened. We went through a pretty bruising renegotiation of our trade agreement with the United States. In general, when we poll Canadians on their views of Donald Trump, the numbers are not very good. So that is a relationship that has become a little frostier in terms of how Canadians view the United States. Again, not Americans, but the U.S. and really sort of the administration there. It's one that's been deteriorating again for a while, and really our view of what's happened in the last 8 weeks, the last 2 months around the pandemic certainly hasn't done anything to increase our favorability of towards the United States.
China has huge buying power, which is obviously a benefit to Canadians. Now, do Canadians want to continue the relationship or look for other trade opportunities?
Well, Canadians are always assessing who we should be trying to get closer to in terms of that trading relationship. And, the EU and the U.S. continue to be at the top of that list, even though we may be a bit annoyed at our largest trading partner, our greatest ally, our next door neighbor in the U.S. You still see significant numbers of Canadians saying, well, look, this is still our largest trading partner. The desire to pursue closer trade ties with China has plummeted down to just 11% among Canadians. And again, you see the clarity and the lack of doubt in the minds of Canadians at this point in time around that relationship. An overwhelming majority, when we ask them, don't believe that the Chinese regime has been transparent about what it has known when it came to the coronavirus. And an overwhelming majority also are of the view that the Chinese telco, Huawei, the big telecom company, should not have a role in building out Canada's 5G mobile network. So again, pretty unequivocal here. We don't really want Chinese companies involved in foreign direct investment. We don't want them building out our mobile networks. And even if there is an economic cost, Canadians appear to be signaling that they're prepared to take that, even if there is economic suffering as a result.
That was my next question. I was wondering, we all want to sort of stand up and say we're going to, stand up to whoever is the problem. But, when it comes down to dollars and cents, you might be, biting your nose in spite of your face.
Well, there is always that. There's always an aspect of it. And indeed, that is why policymakers and politicians in some ways will sometimes dismiss polling results or public opinion results and say, well, we can't make policy based on real politics. But let's also not forget that Justin Trudeau himself, our Prime Minister, attempted to forge some closer trade ties on a mission to China some years ago, and really came back empty-handed. So this is a relationship now that I think Canadians view as rather broken, and they would prefer to pursue relationships with other countries where possible.
Shachi, I want to thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ed.
Shachi Kurl is the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. It appeared the Prime Minister was hesitant to point fingers or lay blame when these views started rising, even referred to it as racist, which I don't believe because the reference is to the Communist Party of China, not the people itself. But in recent days, the Prime Minister is sounding more like he'd like to pursue more evidence. John McKay is a Liberal MP from Scarborough, as well as the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. And he, unlike most of his caucus, has been clear in his views, and he joins us now. And John, it seemed like you were the only Liberal to support or even talk about China in this pandemic. Do you feel more of your caucus is lining up with your view?
Well, good question to which I really don't have a good answer. I think my colleagues are starting to get a little frustrated with the attitude of the government of China, particularly the president. The relationship between China and Canada was deteriorating pre-pandemic, and certainly during the pandemic, things have not improved. And it largely, in part at least, it centers around the W.H.O. That the sense is that a lot of the data was suppressed or manipulated to the benefit of the Communist Party and to the government. But, there's a lot of blame to go around here, Ed. The United States has essentially abandoned the WHO right in the middle of the pandemic. So the entity, the nation to whom the rest of the world looks to for leadership in these multilateral organizations for its own purposes, just abandoned the WHO and left the rest of us to our own devices. And as you well know, power abhors a vacuum. And when the United States decided to do what it did, it kind of gave an implicit permission to the government of China to do what it does best, which is bully the rest of us.
It's interesting. These voices are rising a lot more. And I noticed yesterday, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney went on a tirade, and the consulate and the Chinese consulate in Calgary came back at him. I was a little surprised by that. Were you?
No. I think they call it warrior diplomacy. The Chinese government, for its own purposes, and I'm not quite sure I understand the philosophy, has basically abandoned the protocols of diplomacy and pushed back rather aggressively against any criticism of the government of China, no matter how benign or how well couched. But also take note that our own ambassador in China was pretty aggressive this week in his own commentary about the nation with whom Canada, the nation that he represents in China. And so we may be entering into a new phase of, I was going to say diplomatic niceties. Maybe we're just going to drop the niceties. I take note as well that the Globe and Mail had an interesting cartoon, which was that it was the velvet glove of the government of China donning a knuckle duster. So I think it's I've argued pre-pandemic that we are in a multilateral, multi-phase conflict zone with China, and it doesn't much matter whether it's military or security or intellectual or research or patents. Pick your field. This is a multilateral conflict, and we just better grow up and realize this is a new normal.
Has China been a concern for the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security?
We kind of danced around it at the last Parliament, got into some issues around the provision of teleconference services, primarily around Huawei. But to be candid with you, I didn't think that we really delved into it in the way that we should have. And
what would you like to have delved into more?
Well, I'd like to see the committee take on that entire relationship as a security issue. Primarily, it is, in my judgment, the prime security issue of the 21st century. It is an asymmetrical conflict. Security and defense are leading edges of that conflict, but there's all kinds of other areas of conflict as well. I mean, just this morning's paper, the United States was cutting off Huawei from using chip makers that come from the United States or any other country, presumably with whom the United States does business.
John McKay is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He's the Liberal MP for Scarborough and the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security as we talk about Canadians' views on China. And what about China's story in this outbreak do you want to question?
Pretty well everything. I think I'm not into big conspiracy theories and things of that nature. I would like to just simply take the Australian position, frankly, which is just let us in, see how the data arose. Don't try to manipulate the data. It may well have been that there is a benign explanation. I'll be a little cynical about that, but at least let's start with the data itself. And once we get to a full and transparent disclosure of the data, we can make some decisions as to what's in the best interests of Canada, but also of the rest of the world.
You've called Taiwan a shining light in this crisis. How so, and what could we learn from that?
Well, the Taiwanese have existed with China for the better end of a century, coexisted, I suppose. And have learned a thing or two about how to deal with a nation that is multiply bigger than it is. They've also are the most westernized democratic nation of the Asia Pacific region. So I think we should be paying a bit of attention to how they deal with it, and one of the ways is that they call China out when China needs to be called out.
Now, there's been talk about Magnitsky sanctions legislation for China. How would that work?
It's an attractive tool. I'm not as convinced. I'm friends with Bill Browder and Marcus Kolga, and I think the world of both of them. I'm not as clear how this would be as effective. The underlying theory of Magnitsky legislation is that bad people do bad things in their country of origin, primarily Russia, but other countries as well, and then take their ill-gotten gains and hide them in Canadian real estate and other quote-unquote investments. That may well be happening from China. I'm sure I don't think I'd have to work very hard to find that kind of evidence, but I don't know that that's actually the issue. The issue is the government of China adopting a diplomatic military security posture which is at odds with the rest of the world, and don't really care who they offend, how they deal with the rest of us, and use every power lever that they have. Now, to not say that there isn't some Chinese investment from certain people of dubious origins coming into Canada would be extremely naive. But I with greatest respect, I think that's a bit of a rabbit hole down which we may end up, but that's not the rabbit hole I'd be going down right now.
John, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, and appreciate the questions, and we'll see where this all goes.
John McKay is the Liberal MP for Scarborough and the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. And that leads to our unpublished odd vote question. Does Canada need to reevaluate its relationship with China? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. I want to thank Shashi Kurl of the Angus Reid Institute for joining us, and John McKay, Scarborough MP, Chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.